Thank you very much. I will be continuing the focus, as was already said, on the Globular Amphora culture, networks and migration. We already had a great general introduction by Marcena and Johannsen, and also this fascinating study of the Polish grave sites. So I don't have to spend too much time, of course, on the introduction of this super-regional phenomenon, mainly north and east of the Central European mountains and into the lower mountain ranges. I want to focus a little bit on the problem that these supra-regional phenomena in general pose for us archaeologically. We have this distribution of cultural elements that we refer to as elements of Globular Amphora culture that are not evenly distributed across the region here. And this occasions a number of questions that I think have been addressed more with respect to the following quarterware period, and has been those questions have also been realigned significantly by the advent of 18A evidence. There are three questions, and given, of course, that I don't have so much time, I better get on with them. We'll see how far we get in terms of answering them, but certainly raising them I think is important. So I'd like to ask how different factors such as diffusion and exchange and super-regional networks or migration or other forms of mobility contribute to the formation of this vast Globular Amphora network. What are the questions that are still difficult to address, and how might we progress? And which implications did the spread of cultural similarities within the Globular Amphora network have in relation to the subsequent cultural developments, not least the quarterware period? And I want to say I don't have all that much time, so it's a bit of a tall order for half an hour. So I'll say something fairly general on these two first points, hopefully still nonetheless to the point. And then I will turn to look at this third question about the connection from Globular Amphora into the quarterware period, using the case of the Jutland Peninsula. But hopefully, in turn, I think this will also loop back a little bit on our and let you know how I'm thinking about this. Also, how this might influence our thinking in these larger scale issues. So. The problem I think we have is that it's actually not that easy for us to understand how these elements of Globular Amphora culture dispersed. And again, I would remind you of how recently it is that our discussion of the quarterware period was realigned quite significantly. If you look at the discourse and the discussions as they were most common before the mid-2010s. So we have these maps here, and of course, as I raised yesterday, they are not altogether helpful necessarily. They have a rather big conceptual hold of us. These illustrations, that's both and again, I'm sorry for the color, but these that's both their strength and also again the danger of these. We have this large area here. I want to also get back, as I said in the later part of the talk, to the Jutland Peninsula here. As I said, we have uneven distributions of these materials. Actually, in the part of the southern Scandinavia, the Jutland Peninsula here, where we have the most substantial influence of Globular Amphora culture, quite clearly, certainly the most lasting, in my view, is an area where we have hardly any Globular Amphora pots, but we have other aspects of Globular Amphora culture, which I'll return to in a little bit. So, actually, I like better this much older map published by Marcena quite a few years ago, because it may seem, and again, the color, sorry, is not inherent in my slides, as the projector is feeling it's getting a long meeting. But I actually like this because the arrows quite clearly indicate that these are very permeable boundaries, and also the dynamics of what's going on here, more than our, including my own sort of very monolithic block, distribution block. And also we have these nice indications of Globular Amphora cultural elements outside of their sort of what would be perceived as their sort of normal core range. So this, in a sense, better, I think, signals the complexity of what we're actually dealing with. There's another map here we already saw on the front of Johannsen's recent book, very incredibly rich, inspiring work, and where we could see that we have, from the traditional division of this into a central, western, and eastern group, towards a more sort of a dual division into a western and eastern network. And again, this is based on the ceramics, and of course this is typical that a lot of the discussion, as in many other cultures, is very much centered on the pots. And that is, again, also something that might be a strength in some connections, but also potentially a conceptual stumbling block in other respects. Of course, chronology is important here if we want to discuss how elements of Globular Amphora culture dispersed. And in this most recent overview here by Johannes, you can see we have certainly some aspects of some earlier core areas, and then the dispersal of Globular Amphora cultural elements to other areas. And I want to just skip right to Johannes' conclusion. I think he'll agree that this was taken out of the context. But here, in very brief, he says, as far as mobility is concerned, there is, except for Bohemia and the Western Ukraine, currently no need to explain mobility, for instance, with the dynamic diffusion model. In other words, migration, or a certain aspect, certain form of migration. And he goes on to emphasize, as we also saw in the first presentation here, other forms of mobility. So the more cyclical mobility in the economic model, the socio-economic organization of Globular Amphora communities, I agree fully. Also in other parts of the Globular Amphora network, as also you can check, I have published a paper last year where I very much arrive at the same conclusion. Nonetheless, when it comes to this larger area here, I do struggle quite a bit with this conclusion. Because so we have migration here in this part here, perhaps down here, but the other here is then not migration. I think there's a lot of stuff going on in this area, and I think it's also very well illustrated in Johannes' book. We already heard a little bit about these settlement and land use patterns. Here we see in central Germany the distribution of Globular Amphora and Bernburg groups on the soil types. Here it just says bad to good, and I guess that's when it comes to arable agriculture. And you can see that the Bernburg groups are on the agriculturally good soils, whereas the Globular Amphora groups tend to seek out the poorer soils. So, which, and again, you can understand, and that also Voidisch also wrote about this, and maybe this is a different economic strategy, which makes sense from a more pastoral point of view, to go for the lighter soils, where you have an easier opening of the landscape when you get a grazing pressure. So. But then, of course, you have very different situations here in Bohemia, where there seems to be much more of a overlapping picture. And again, Johannes and Marcena already also told us about this. We have this very variable situation also in different parts of Poland, northern Germany, for instance, where we seem to have, in some cases, very overlapping, in some cases, quite separated patterns. I completely buy Marcena's suggestion or conclusion that we are dealing with different groups. The question, of course, what do we mean by different groups? We could, of course, they could be just members of society who broke out and, I don't know, became punk culture or the Mormons or something else. We have these examples from more modern culture where we have subcultures that emerge out of an existing culture. But I would like to also pose the alternative suggestion or question whether, in fact, perhaps we are dealing with different groups that move around quite a lot, and that migration in a very complex interplay with cultural exchange and diffusion is in fact the main mode of dispersal. And I would like to remind that the only reason why discussions of quarterware have been as reconfigured as they are is that the quality of step-for-step ancestry is so clear. It's so different. What we would be looking for here is much more subtle, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. So, but I think one problem we have is a conceptual challenge. So, what would we mean by migration? If people are moving around here, I mean, we have all kinds of mobility. Think about modern times. We have transcontinental migration. We have Roma communities that travel around. We have many different variants, and trying to nuance this understanding of migration is part of is the central task of a book that I and some colleagues have on the way out. I think it's more or less physically in the press now. It should be out in the summer here, where we try to hold a lot of different European Neolithic cases up with later prehistoric and also other cases, also historical cases in other parts of the world, to look at these many different forms of migration. And as you may note, we have the subtitle here is The Archaeology and Politics of Mobility. And this goes back to a comment that I very much agreed with that you made yesterday, Johannsen, about the agency. We should not take the agency out of these things. I mean, people migrate in small and large groups over small and large distances for longer or shorter durations of time, and they migrate back sometimes for many different reasons. Also, I would like to emphasize this book here, where I think there are also a couple of people in the audience, Christian and David, contributed to, which also, whereas at least some of the papers go into similar questions. So I think there are a lot of productive discussions of this being taken very recently. So another thing is a methodological challenge. And that has to do with the resolution. As I said, the step-for-step ancestry is a very blatant genetic signal in many ways compared to what we would be looking for here. But as it happens, genetics, of course, as you know, is not a done and fully formed science. It's still developing quite a lot. We have improvements in imputation, new imputation models. This is a paper published last year. This is another paper also came out late last year, which has again a new type of IBD, so identity by descent modeling, and the overall outcome of these sorts of methodological efforts is that resolution is improving, and that is something that will continue as we go forward. We cannot now prove the role of migration. I cannot prove my suggestion here whether migration was very important. Also, we cannot prove the opposite. I consider it fully an empirical question. I don't have any strong sentiments in favor of one or the other. But I think there are some things pointing in the direction of migration. Time will tell. I will put a good deal of my money on migration. And hopefully also the last part of my talk will support, or you at least provide some food for thought on why I think that further. So. Yesterday, I think David noted that there are some 300 wagon burials across the steppe zone of Eurasia. Up here in this northern part of the Jutland Peninsula, we have some 300 cart burials. which might be more famous if it weren't for the fact that we also had more or less ideal conditions for the breakdown of organic material in our soils. So we have rather bad preservation, but nonetheless, I'll show you a few slides in a little bit. We also have rather extensive exchange of Globular Amphora type battle axes going up to northern Jutland, and also then the late funnelbeak or tier B types going down to Mecklenburg and potentially further afield. So there seems to be some we have very few examples of Globular Amphora pots here. There's something else going down here, which is forthcoming with some museums colleagues, but fortunately cannot present that now. These are these so-called stone heap graves. They have the rather dull name from the big heap of stones that were put on top of them. No mound of turf or sods or soil. So of course very high oxygen levels, percolation of rainwater, free access for lots of organisms that like to delve into the organic material. Combine that with acidic, well-drained soils, and that's your recipe. So we only have some organic material when we have a later barrow, so a quarter-ware barrow added briefly or shortly after in relative terms these were constructed. They are dated approximately within this range here, and again some 300 have been excavated to date. They are aligned in linear symmetries. Here, see excavated. I just want to, perhaps I should say here, we have these three typical features, more or less rectangular structure here, where we have the usually have the funerary items, and then a pair of cattle in these bathtub-shaped pits. So again, we saw a very spectacular example of a lot of cattle in one deposition in Belarus that Marcena showed. Here we have a very massive allocation of resources in this burial custom, which is clearly indicative that they had cattle to spare. So again, they're aligned in these linear symmetries. Note the scale here. This is 500 meters, and here's an excerpt. So you see here, these are individual stone heap graves alongside the route used at the time, also in later periods. And as you see, the total length of this linear symmetry here is just under 2 kilometers. And we have some other interesting examples of those. So I could speak about those for another hour, but I will have to turn to another important element of the argument I'm trying to make, which is to jump into the decades immediately after this, or overlapping with this stone heap grave custom, so the early corded ware period. And I want to use also, I think Marcena mentioned the word a proxy. You could also, in a sense, take this as a proxy. These grave and palisade constellations, early corded ware period. No one had done a systematic study of those until recently, so my PhD student Simon and I took it upon ourselves to do so, because we have actually quite a few of them on the peninsula. I'm not sure if you can see, but there are numbers in these larger dots indicating the number of structures at sites where we have multiple. So we have up to 9 of these in one site here. So 139 and they're all from the early corded ware period. Of course, it's a phenomenon known super-regionally in the corded ware area, and in fact, we propose in this article that it's been kind of overlooked as one of these corded ware period, corded ware cultural elements with a super-regional distribution in the very early phase. But again, it's a slightly longer discussion. Here's an example from Poland. Going back to the Jutland Peninsula, they have been referred to these as ring ditches, which doesn't say a lot. It says what we find as archaeologists when we encounter the site. But as you see, here's one example where we have a part of the burnt down palisade. So it was a palisade that was surrounding the deceased person, probably in a multi-stage burial rite, where there was a certain period where the dead person had to be protected or held within this circle, and then it seems to have been destroyed by fire in many cases. So, and this is just a section through where you can see the planks here to one of the the structures that we excavate ourselves in the Østerbøl Hede area, we have quite a few of those. So this is a reconstruction also made at a visitor center in northern Jutland. So incorrect in the sense that that the palisades would have been quite a lot higher, but nonetheless, of course, gives some sort of impression of the structure. So we knew that we could see quite clearly that there was a lot of variation in these graven palisade constellations. Just for looking at the outer diameter of the palisade dishes, we could see, okay, there's a rather wide span. Of course, we have some more typical dimensions, but then we have some very large structures as well. So we were curious to see how can we look more systematically. We also knew that there was something about the distribution of particular funerary items also. So we wanted to look more systematically at this the investment made in these graven palisade constellations. So we looked at 4 parameters. The outer diameter of the circular ditch, as you just saw, and the ditch volume, which is the width times the depth. So which would say something about the dimensions of the palisade. Of course, it doesn't have to, but in normal case, it would probably say something about the size of the palisade. Then the number of categories of funerary items, so not the number of individual artifacts, but a number of different categories. For instance, battle axe would be one category, and ceramics another, amber discs a third, and so forth. And then the last one, the depth of the burial pit. This is something that has been used as a chronological criterion. Of course, is saying we have the deeper burials are the older ones, and we can show that there are clearly something else at work, also some regional differences independent of the chronology. So we combined all of these into an overall investment score, ranging, which had quite a wide range. And of course, this required that we transformed the different values into the same format, so we could compare them in one index. And but the quantitative proportions are kept intact. And as I already said, we could see impressionistically that there were some significant differences, and we knew there were a lot of these smaller palisades in the north. There were also fewer stone battle axes, stone shaft-all axes, usually called battle axes. But we were nonetheless somewhat astonished when we saw the result of the inverse distance weighted interpolation, where we asked the program to say, okay, so low investment is blue and high investment is red. And this is what happened. We got a very clear division of the peninsula with lower investment values in the north and higher investment values in the south. And so we thought, okay, it seems a little too spectacular to be true. So we tried to say, maybe is this an artifact of the way that we have gone about this? So we tried several things. We made obviously statistical tests, which showed very clearly that these are, for all intents and purposes, 2 statistically separate populations in the material, so to speak. So they are statistically distinct. Also, if you look at each of the 4 parameters independently of one another, for each of those, the mean is lower, or the average is lower than the mean in the north and higher than the mean in the south. So it's not driven by 1 or 2 of these parameters, but across all 4 of them. So something's going on that we had to explain. And by the way, if others like me bite their nails on American election nights, if you think that these are Republicans in the South and Democrats in the North, it's purely coincidental, and so no reference intended. Okay, so we had to try and explain this because it wouldn't quite go away, this pattern. So we came up with a number of alternative explanatory scenarios. So one would be perhaps the most straightforward one, to go to a relative poverty scenario. So poverty in the sense economic, comparably economic, lower productivity, say that people in the north simply had fewer resources available The only thing is this doesn't really make sense. We have already a transition in this period, as we also saw in other regions, to a more pastoral economy. And if anything, this region here with very good access to very highly productive shore meadows, also known from historical times to be extremely productive cattle export to the Hanseatic towns to the south. So this is a very, very productive area, and certainly not less productive than this area. So it doesn't quite make sense here in relation to these areas. Another would be an inferior network position scenario. So, and this might actually be relevant for explaining, for instance, the fact that we have fewer of these stone shaft hole, so-called battle axes in the north. That might explain. But again, it doesn't make sense for the palisade dimensions. It doesn't make sense for the depth of the burial pit, for instance. So it would be difficult to see how that would be related to an inferior position in the wider corded-ware network. Then we have the third, which is what you might call a competition marginalization scenario, which is a variant of the first, I guess. So we know that we have migrants coming in on the Jutland Peninsula. And then if we imagine that we have this rather well-consolidated population in northern Jutland, then we could imagine people coming in and then being relegated to the less productive areas. But as I will show you in a little bit, we can demonstrate that is clearly not what happens, that they would be separated out to different, less favorable part of the landscape. That's not what's happening. On the contrary, we have to look to the fourth, the possibility of what we call a cultural admixture scenario. Again, the next sort of slightly astonishing moment was when we then turned on the distribution map for these stone-hip graves. So these Globular Amphora network teamed cattle cart burials. Because as you can see, the overlap or the co-occurrence between their distribution and then this northern zone in the early corded-ware period with the lower investment burials is quite significant, and we understand that as indicating that the cultural substrate somehow makes a big difference for how this new burial rite with this grave and palisade constellations is brought into play. But what is it then? What about this Globular Amphora network? What is it about this area and what is existing already that leads to this particular form with the lower investment? You're sort of watering down, if you like, of this corded-ware custom. So, as already said, you can see that these groups are not separated in the landscape. This is this Østerbølle Hede area here. This is the Lærkenfeld River. This is the Vestrup area. This is Østerbølle Hede here. So a largish local area where we have the stone-hip graves. So, and as you see here, in each of these dots is a cemetery. It's not a burial. It's a linear cemetery. Some of them quite large. And here you have also each of these are a row of stone-hip graves, the squares, and then you have the early corded-ware different structures, including these mortuary palisade and grave constellations, very, very close to one another. Some of them, in fact, on top of one another, so where they have the early corded-ware structure on top of the late TRB or Globular Amphora network structure. I have to recommend also, Simon did a follow-up study, which is where he went into this more systematically across many different sites. In this article, we only just showed it for this area here. So it's clear that there's no perceived need for a clear break in terms of the burial rites conceptually between these groups. To us, that indicates that we have an integration of something coming in and the groups and the practices that are already in the area. Other aspects to consider is that these stone-hip graves are already a form of single graves. They're already individual graves, of course, of a rather different morphology and particular symbolism than the corded-ware period graves. They are also already in these communities, as I said, have transitioned into a more pastoral economy. The sites are seeking out the lighter soils, so especially the transition between the coarser and lighter sandy soils. There are some that seem to be on clay here, but that are actually locally on fine sand. So they're clearly going for a different part of the landscape. There are also some continuation in the super-regional connections to different parts of central Germany and Poland that we see between the late GRB groups and into the early Quarterware period. And speaking of these connections here, so one of the interesting results of one of the paper that came out early this year, this larger study of population genomics of post-glacial Western Eurasia, was that we could see that there's a clear contribution of Globular Amphora in the Quarterware groups. And this was perceived here as being part of the formation of the Quarterware in a demographic sense. So this typical combination of forest steppe traits with Neolithic or Anatolian farmer in genetic terms, genetic traits. This was found here and very much driven by this improved resolution from the better imputation, but also using slightly different methods. The same was arrived at by Ringbauer et al. With the new IBD method. So this is interpreted by both groups, including myself here also, as having to do with the formation of the Quarterware. Then you can say maybe there are some challenges or problems with the chronology of the interaction between the eastern Globular Amphora and then the steppe forest steppe groups. But the problem is the alternative, which is theoretically possible, is that we get this contribution for the Globular Amphora in all the regions subsequently. Of course, this is theoretically possible that the Quarterware people groups disperse and then they interact with Globular Amphora. But it seems to be so consistent in their genetic makeup that this would have to happen in quite early on for more or less all of the Quarterware groups in the regions where they arrive. Again, theoretically possible, but I think a less plausible explanation than the suggestion that this is happening as part of the formation of these groups in a demographic sense. But again, of course, this is an empirical question for further discussion. The only thing is that when these Quarterware migrants, Quarterware period migrants, come in onto the Jutland Peninsula, they do so during the 29th century BCE. So this is not centuries after this formation of Quarterware in a demographic sense. This is decades after. So some of these people will have some sort of recollection, you know, that origin myths and cultural background is of course, is retold and tailored to different agendas, not least in connection with migrations. But nonetheless, some of these people are going to have some sort of knowledge of some sort of connection to a Globular Amphora context. I don't know, maybe, you know, yes, my grandmother's family used to bury cattle or whatever. So of course we cannot prove this, but again, if you look at the empirical information we have, this is almost follows by logic that some people will have had that kind of knowledge or awareness. So maybe there's also an identity, a normative kind of connection. We also see in modern cases of migration, of course, sometimes these perceived ideas of normative commonality or connectedness or otherwise can make a big difference in how migration plays out. Yes, so I don't know how far as I went and answered all these questions, but I think certainly I think they're important to raise, and there are lots of, as you can see, lots of work to still do also with the Globular Amphora complex, where I think we are, the discussions are perhaps where the discussions of the Quarterware were a little while ago. So plenty of, at least some food for thought. Thanks for your attention.